warmly welcome to all of you. We are really glad that you are joining us at our 6th webinar. My name is Pauline Tillman. I'm project manager at DW Akademie, and I bring together 16 successful media entrepreneurs from all over the world together. Almost every month, we are organizing a webinar like this, and for our startups, but also for DW Akademie colleagues. And since August 2019, we have been discussing about mental health, but also about digital security, about nonviolent communication, and most recently about remote work. And today we will focus on virtual consultancy. We will get to know what are the main differences between face-to-face and consultancy in a virtual space. We will talk about key elements, about the main role of consultant. We will talk about useful tools and also how mentees can be motivated on the long run. Our speakers will share their personal experiences, which are huge, as both of them are extraordinary experienced consultants, and I would like to introduce both of them so that you do know better who will talk in a minute. I start with James Breiner, who gained experience with media startups in Latin America for about 12 years now. He was publisher at Baltimore Business Journal, and his focus nowadays is on coaching, training, and consulting. And Breiner works as a professor at Pamplona in Spain on entrepreneurial journalism and organized many webinars and online courses about organizational development for media startups. And we are really glad that you're with us today, James.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And we have also Russ Suttles, who's an experienced consultant in fundraising and revenue streams, but he knows also a lot about management and improving the structure of an organization. He has been working for media startups in Europe, in US, Asia, and in Latin America. And since 2018, he is professor at the university in Hong Kong, teaching digital journalism and entrepreneurial journalism. And both of them have to teach their students right now from home office. And if they succeed doing so, you can ask them later if you want. But James and Ross will each of them show us a presentation of about 20 minutes. And James will start with focusing on how to guide the conversation with a mentee, and Ross will proceed giving guidance on the structure and also on the discipline of virtual coaching. And in the end, there will be about 30 minutes approximately for discussion. So if you do have any questions, you can write them in the chat box and we will go through them all together. You can also, of course, ask some questions directly. You just have to raise your hand. And the last remark from my side, the session will be recorded and afterwards uploaded on YouTube, as there will be also people, startups, but also DW Akademie colleagues who would like to see what we are talking about, but who are not able to join us today. So if they're interested in the virtual consulting topic, they can afterwards see the recorded session. And now, James, I would give the word to you.
Okay. Well, one of the big differences for being a virtual coach as opposed to being a in-person coach is that, you know, the face-to-face contact, which is so important. And it's also sometimes a little bit more difficult to get, it's easier for people to avoid you online virtually than it is in the real world. And so you have to be very insistent upon the responsibility of people showing up for your sessions and being prepared and so forth. At any rate, what I did want to talk about today mostly is about how you can be an active listener. Your job as a coach is to listen well and to guide the learner or the mentee through your questions to help them find solutions. So I'm going to share my screen now, and we're going to go to my presentation, and we're going to do this. Okay, so you all should be seeing Virtual Coach. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, super.
Very good. Okay. So For entrepreneurs, if you happen to be coaching entrepreneurs, if you happen to be coaching people who are working in the digital space, one of the things you have to realize as a coach is that this is, by definition, is uncharted territory. These people are inventing everything. There's no real clear path for them, so you have to help them find it, and you have to help them use the tools that they have. So your job as a coach is mainly through listening to remove barriers for these entrepreneurs, to help them consider possibilities that they might not have otherwise considered. You want them to open up their understanding of the world. You want to have them stretch. And so you can do that through asking questions. One of the important things you will learn as a coach, if you're even the director of a media organization, is that most of the issues that you face have to do with people, and it has to do with communication, and it has to do with listening. And so that's what I wanted to focus on with you. Part of the issue of coaching, what it is it's fulfilling commitments and doing follow-up. And Ross is going to talk a lot about that, the structure and the discipline of coaching. So I'm not going to dwell too much on that. What it's not a conversation. It's not a chat. It has to be something that's structured and directed. And again, Ross is going to get into that. It's not a complaint session. It's not a time where you can get dragged into conversations about, this is impossible or that's impossible or anything like that. And it's not when you have time. It has to be something where you and the learner are committed to making progress and to meeting. So some rules and boundaries, again, I'm going to let Ross talk more about this, but confidentiality is absolutely important, because if it's important for developing trust. The learner or mentee will not be able to tell you things that are getting in the way unless they feel like they can completely trust you. And you, as the mentor, coach, you have to be utterly frank to save time. We can't be tiptoeing around. One of the rules I have, and I had in my sessions with, when I was publisher of the Baltimore Business Journal, I had 5 department managers. One for editorial, one for advertising, one for circulation and marketing, one for production, and one for administration. And I had a rule with them that, when they came to the meeting with me, they could complain about something, whine or whinge, is if you want to use the British word. They could complain or whine for 2 minutes. And then I would have to say, okay, time out. Now, do you want to do something about this? Because if you don't want to do anything about it and you don't want to talk about how we can solve this, we're moving on. And then this can be a very valuable piece of information if the learner comes back every week or every 2 weeks or every time you have a meeting and the same situation is coming up over and over again. Then you have something that maybe you can explore with the learner, a topic that you realize they have to confront and do something about. And by the way, the reason you would know that is that you should take notes during the sessions, and you should insist that the learner, mentee, also take notes so that you can record progress, so that you can return to issues. So basically, it can help you keep track of the progress that person's making. And then take nothing personally. for those of you who are managers, sometimes when a mentee comes in and starts complaining about something, you have to, it might in some cases be criticism of your performance, or you might perceive it as criticism of your performance. And you have to be absolutely calm and take nothing personally and say something like, well, tell me more about that. Well, tell me, why do you think that's true? And so forth. So that, again, you want to have that kind of open communication so that you can really find out what's going on. Again, when I was the coach basically for my managers at the Baltimore Business Journal, many times I would have to hear my employees say things that I could personally take as criticism. But the value of this is that you can identify problems in the organization, and then the mentee can help you solve them. If you're aware of problems and you have this kind of open and fluid communication, you're in a much better position to solve them. Okay, so what kind of questions should we ask? We're going to go through a whole bunch of them. They should be open-ended questions, not yes/no questions. Again, because you're trying to guide the person with your questions. You want to ask the how and the why. Socratic questions you want to ask, don't tell. So you're a guide, not a general. You're gonna try to help these people find the path. You don't pick the path. They can't do what you do. They don't have the experience that you have. They don't have the same talents that you have. They may have better experience than you have. They may have greater talents than you have. So as you guide them towards solutions, you can't say, what I would do this. Well, if I were you, I would do that. No, that's not going to work. So again, this is why you have to ask. So what do you do as a coach? You ask them to observe. They may be looking at a situation like, our advertising revenue is down. We have lower advertising revenue. Well, you have to ask them to make lots of observations about why that could be, who are the people who are responsible for advertising revenue, what kinds of things are they doing, what are their activities. Ask the mentee to make observations, gather evidence, and then ask them, what does it mean? What can you do about that? So some effective questions, well, there's a lot of them. What are you tolerating at work? This is an open-ended question that, when you're beginning a session of coaching with a mentee, this can be a very good question at getting at some of the sort of the fundamental problems that a manager is having at work. What are you tolerating? Are you tolerating performance issues? What are you tolerating? What kind of behavior are you tolerating? What kind of quality of performance are you tolerating? And maybe they're not tolerating anything. Maybe they're just completely happy. What makes you angry or upset? What are you upset about? By the way, one of the questions that I like to ask at the beginning of a session with a mentee is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how's it going? If you were to ask them, how's it going? They're going to say fine, or they're going to say fine, or they're going to say good, or something like that. And that, it gives you no evidence, and it doesn't make them think. So what you always want your mentee to be doing is thinking about what's going on and observing. So if you ask them, on a scale of 1 to 10, how's it going? Well, they have to think about that. Well, maybe it's a 7, maybe it's a 5. But as they're doing that, they're thinking about how it's going. And that's what you want. You want them to be thinking and observing and measuring and analyzing. And a good question, what or who is stopping you from doing whatever it is you want to do? What's in the way? What's in the way, and then what can you do about it? If you could change one thing about what's happening in your operation today or this week or this month, what would it be? My own experience, I worked with a coach, an executive coach, for about 2 years, and I interviewed 3 potential coaches, and one of them who I interviewed, I did sort of a test session with him. Basically, he was telling me everything to do, and like most people, I really didn't want somebody ordering me around telling me what to do. The guy I eventually hired asked me this question: if you could change one thing about your business journal operation today, what would it be? And I have to tell you, that question pulled from me something I said out loud what I needed to do. I needed to replace a particular person. And by saying it out loud, I realized I've been thinking about this forever and I haven't done anything about it. And that question put me into action. You want your questions to be future oriented. You want your mentee to get into action about things, which is why we're focused on, what can you do about something? We're not going to worry too much about the past. We're going to learn from the past, but we're going to focus on the future. And then if someone is really stuck without telling them what to do, you can say, well, what's the possibility that such and such is happening? Have you considered the possibility that such and such? Again, these are kind of leading questions, and you want them to be leading questions because you want the person to analyze. What does success look like to you? What would it take to achieve it? What's in the way? And what can you do about it? When they don't do something, if they don't do something that you've asked them to do, or if they're avoiding doing something, if you're getting if you're getting a lot of excuses about something, my experience is that very often, but not always, very often, they don't know how. They don't know how to do what you're asking them to do. You may say, well, give me a report on tactics and strategy for building our circulation revenue. And maybe you've done it 50 times, but they've never done it. So they don't know how to do it, and so they're afraid to tell you, or maybe they're afraid to confront someone. Maybe there's an employee at work who's causing disruptions or bad morale. It's a person with a bad temper, and they're afraid to talk to them. And this is where you can help them frame the conversation. You can work with your mentee to find ways to talk to a person. This is always a lot easier to do when you're face to face and you can see the person's expressions, and you can and it's a whole body experience, the voice, the tone, the presence. But you can do a lot of this virtually as well. And to some extent, what you're going to do, you need to figure out ways to have fluid interchange of materials, so that they're afraid to confront someone. You need to be able to share materials with them that maybe either during or after the session that they can use. to work on the problem. Often they're ashamed that they don't know how to do something. You know, for most, I think most managers are put in positions of leadership because they're talented and they're intelligent, but they don't know how to do the job because they've never done the job. Now, some people are very confident and they figure, I'm going to figure it out. But others, they like to know exactly what to do, or they want to feel confident that they know what to do. So, but they're ashamed to say, you know, I've never done that before. I really don't know how to do that. They're ashamed to say it. So you have to bring that out. You have to give them the room and the space and the permission to admit that they don't know. And for many people, that's very hard to do. It's very hard for them to admit that I don't know. There's something that's embarrassing. And I'm going to wrap this up with just a little bit on criticism, how to give and receive criticism. And I'm stealing this from the 1 Minute Manager. It's a publication, a book that was pretty popular. The 1 Minute Manager. I'll type it in the chat in a minute. But one of the things you want to do is make sure that as you're giving feedback to someone, you're giving feedback about the work, not the person. This is particularly true with younger people, millennials in particular. They tend to believe that if you're criticizing their work, that you're criticizing them. So one way to address that is avoid using the word you in any language when you're giving feedback. Talk about the work. This work is unacceptable, or this work is, but not your work. This work does not meet our standards, and that sort of thing. Okay. So I think that's about it. Just be focused on future-oriented stuff. Leadership and coaching, it's all about people, and it's all about talking to people. It's all about learning how to listen. So actively listen, keep a record by taking notes. And with that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Ross Settles. Ross, I know you're going to be great.
James, before we move forward to Ross, there's a question by Enrique. Perhaps we can answer to that immediately. So she's asking, what to do when they repeatedly
don't do what you ask. Well, I'm going to let Ross answer that. No, you have to define what the consequences are. I mean, they have to know that there are consequences. And in small operations, sometimes that's very hard because if you take action against one person, it's like in a family almost, and it's tough. So, but they have to understand that if you don't do things, there will be consequences. And what are they? Disapproval. For many people, just having the coach say, this is not acceptable to me. I'm disappointed. Say, I'm disappointed. This is not acceptable. Not you did a bad thing or you're not doing the work. It's this is unacceptable that this work has not been done, and I'm disappointed. So you bring it on you, and then that gives them a little more permission and space. And beyond that, I'm delighted to hear what Ross has to say.
This is a less personal response, but usually when an executive, when a media leader has something that has been recommended to do, it's because it drives a certain outcome. So maybe they need to improve their financial management in order to hit it. So oftentimes the answer is, all right, then you help me find another way to achieve. We agree that this is the right outcome.
Yeah.
And we've recommended this approach. It's the approach that seems to work well in other places. But if you have another approach and kind of put the onus of ownership on them.
I think that's great.
Just because it's a lot of times what seems so obvious to the consultant may miss a detail that makes the implementation of something very straightforward in other places almost impossible in some places. So, but I kind of always come back to, what is the outcome this action is supposed to achieve? All right, do you have another way of getting to the outcome? We agree this is the outcome we want. So what's the other approach then?
I like that a lot. I like that approach a lot.
Okay, Ross. Now, I would suggest that you just go on with your presentation in the next 20 minutes, and then we will have another half an hour for discussing other questions.
All right, then I'm not sure I can do exactly the same approach. I'm going to fill the screen with my face here, or with my presentation. Sorry, let me back all the way to the beginning. So I'm going to talk about this a little more clinically and probably a little more consulting-ease, a little bit more consultancy and a little less coaching. But still, I think the two pieces overlap. One is very what I'm talking about is very process-oriented and a little less leadership, not less leadership-oriented, but less personally oriented. So I start with, there are some basic ground rules, and these, you'll hear in this some echoes of what Jim has just been talking to you about. But when you go into any consultancy, whether it's as a virtual consultant or whether you're on site as a premise consultant, you have to always remember that it's not your company. You've been brought in to provide guidance, to provide mentoring, to provide advice and counsel. And sometimes the executives will decide to go a different way. They will achieve the outcome in a different way, or they will choose different outcomes. And what you have to do is you make the best recommendation you can, get your ego out of the way. If the organization chooses to adopt it, great. If they choose to go a different way, then you as a consultant, you need to kind of get your personality out of the way, reset to where the organization has gone to, and then start up again. And you kind of have to do all of that without blinking an eye. But I've seen over a long time in doing this, I've seen a lot of very, not young consultants, but consultants that maybe come directly from industry, who have been a publisher or been a media leader in another organization, who come and they kind of give instruction, they don't give advice. Instruction is something that is yours. Advice is something you're sharing. And so you want to kind of separate the two. In my world, this is more of an institutional consultancy, less a personal coaching. So you are working to move the institution forward, and you're doing that through individuals, but in the end, the goal is the institutional improvement, whether it's greater sustainability, greater impact, more organizational efficiency, whatever the goal is, they're usually institutional goals. The third kind of ground rule, and Jim mentioned this up front, confidentiality is everything. It can be defined differently in different engagements. Sometimes the engagement is only with one particular leader of the organization, and so the confidentiality is one person to one person. Sometimes it will be with the entire executive team, and so you'll have to manage confidentiality both internally as well as externally. The last thing I would recommend, and this sounds very easy, but especially when you're doing virtual consulting, basic business etiquette is incredibly important. If you set a meeting, show up. And that goes for both you and whoever you're consulting with. If there are materials to be prepared, everybody goes over them. But there's a certain basic set of etiquette that you need to bring to a meeting the same way you wouldn't walk into a conference room in a pair of shorts and flip-flops. You don't want to show up on a virtual meeting as if you've just stumbled out of bed. And I know it sounds obvious, but in these days of constant virtual interaction, it sometimes takes a little effort. But my ground rules are very much institutionally focused for the most part. So what I've done is I've kind of gone through this as an engagement. So from meeting 1 to meeting 2 to meeting 3 to meeting 4, and realizing that these are all virtual interactions. So the way I usually think of meeting 1 is there's been some interaction to establish the relationship, but even with that interaction, there's an initial engagement. Sometimes it's called the kickoff meeting, sometimes it's called the groundwork meeting, but it's basically establishing the terms of the virtual communication. So in a consultancy, sometimes you'll be working with an individual. So maybe you're working with the managing director or the CEO or the managing partner of an organization. But sometimes you may decide in the preparation for the engagement that you're going to work with the entire executive team in some fashion. And it often happens is, I think Pauline mentioned up front, I'm currently working on a lot of organizational effectiveness things. And oftentimes, on organizational engagements, you're really working with the entire team. The other thing that you often try to set up front is the how you communicate. Is it Zoom? Is it meeting? Is it Skype? How confidential and how much security is involved? So do you need end-to-end secure communications? Do you need a shared file structure so that you can share documents or co-edit documents? But that you usually establish in the very first meeting. And that's simple, and it's often done in the last 15 minutes of the meeting, the last 20 minutes of the meeting. The second dot point, and this is almost the most important dot point, is whoever you're engaged with, whether it's a single individual or a team, you spend a lot of time in the first meeting getting them to articulate the problem or problems you're being asked to engage on. Organizational effectiveness, revenue development, sustainability, newsroom management. At the same time, you yourself, not so much in the meeting, but as part of listening to the interaction, listening to the people on the call, and anything you've learned about the organization prior to the meeting, you're developing your own sense of what is your objective definition or articulation of the problem that you're going to be working on. For this first meeting, I can't emphasize how important pre-work is. And I say that because it means if they are publishing a website, what websites are they publishing? If they're on a podcast, if they're publishing podcasts or video, listen to one or two of them. Get a sense of how frequently they're publishing. Is it a regular, high-velocity, multiple article a day site? Is it a magazine online? Is it what exactly what is their institution doing? And you should have a sense of that when you come into the organization. And that allows you to kind of listen to the problem as they define it and then try to see how it's manifest in what the institution is actually doing. But this is the first meeting really just lays the groundwork. In meeting 2, sometimes it takes 2 meetings. I find virtual meetings longer than 90 minutes become kind of tedious. So something you might be able to do in a single meeting in person, where you might take a lunch break and come back and do another 90 minutes. Virtually, you may have to break it into 2 different days, do it 2 different meetings. But in this, after you set the groundwork, you're going to start establishing what are the goals for what's going to make this consulting engagement a success? How will they determine whether it's a success? How will the consultant determine whether it's a success? So, and some of the way you're going to do that is there may be some information that you're going to gather from the client. And I treat this, especially in single person engagements, I treat this very situationally. So I often develop what's called an information request, but it's going to be very specific to the problem that you're working on. So if you don't need financial information, you don't ask for it. If you don't need to know who the salary role and who gets paid what, don't ask for it. Keep your information request very focused on the problem you're solving. It keeps security of information very clean. but it keeps you very focused on what you're trying to achieve. Sometimes a client will over-provide information. Sometimes it's because that's the only way they have the information prepared. Sometimes they're going to give you a board book, something that they've prepared for their board. I will often, unless it's no other way, unless it creates a lot of additional work and a lot of additional time before I get what I think we need to understand the problem, I generally push back. You know, it's just take pictures of the relevant pages. I don't need the whole board book. If you end up working on a problem that spans a team, so maybe the managing director, the financial manager, the editor-in-chief, keep any information requests to one person. So, and that's usually, there'll usually be somebody in that kind of engagement that is the chief client officer, the person that you report to, the person that, if you're having an issue internally with different people on the team, that you ask questions of or you get feedback from. Keep those information requests to a single person. So don't ask one person for one thing and another person for another thing. It's very easy, especially if tension builds in the engagement, for people to think you're playing one side of the organization off of the other. And that's something that consultants are also often suspect of doing. And the best way to avoid that is to keep all information flows going through one person. Let them ask for what you think you need from different departments. But getting back to establishing goals. Usually in the first meeting, you have with the team or with the executive you're working with, established a few key deliverables. What will make this engagement, so at the end of this, and I often ask this in the very first meeting, you look back at the end of 6 months of consulting, what question are you going to ask that will let you know that this has been a successful engagement? And then you kind of build out the deliverables, as we say in the old consulting practice. From there, it could be revenue increases. It could be clearer employee recognition and employee reviews. It could be, but it's usually something quite measurable. It doesn't have to be measurable in the sense of numbers, but it is, we executed this, this was completed. We increased this by this much. And generally, the deliverable is institutionally focused, as opposed to a more coaching approach, which would be almost more personally focused. As Jim was saying, you know, what's the obstacle you face in making this? This is really, you know, how do I increase revenue? All right, so let's talk about what are the deliverables? How are we going to break that problem down? Once you've done that, and this may be in the second of the 2 meetings here, you come up with some sort of timeline. It's a reasonable timeline. So we're going to be working this problem over a series of meetings with the sales and marketing group. And it's going to take us 4 weeks to get to a set of actions that we'll make a recommendation on. And you'll kind of write all of that down. And that's the scope and direction of the work. And so that's kind of the beginning, the kind of defining the engagement, how are you going to interact virtually? And then secondly, what are you going to deliver? What's the thing you're going to fix? And that's just, you know, I spent a long time as just a consultant, and it's in the end, that's the thing they're paying you for. Then you're going to start what we call working the problem, or oftentimes the problems. And this will go on meeting as long as the engagement exists. So on different deliverables, I would say a couple of things. Different deliverables often have different leads. So you may be working on an organizational effectiveness and revenue increase. Those could easily have 2 different leads in the organization, both responsible to the managing director, but they may have different leads. So you're going to have to be somewhat flexible in how you engage these leads. Again, try to be focused on the institutional success. It's often very easy to get caught up in internal politics if you're working on a team approach. Whoever the key client is, whether it's the managing director or some executive who's managing the whole project, make sure they're always informed, that they're CC'd on everything, they know what process is going on, they know how deliverables are proceeding, are things on time, are they ahead of schedule, are they behind schedule. Each virtual conversation, Jim mentioned this a little bit, There should be pre-work that either you as the consultant are doing and submitting, or everybody is doing a piece of and submitting in some sort of shared file system or some sort of shared email system. There is always an agenda, even if it's a short agenda: introduction, catch up, and then next steps. There's always an agenda. And there's always a summary. And this comes back to something Jim said that I thought was incredibly important: is always keep notes. I don't care how you keep notes, but always keep notes. Because in the end, you want to make sure that the summary that the organization creates is consistent with the summary you think you heard. And if not, you're going to have to intercede in some way to find out why that's happening. And then each of those deliverable processes goes on about, whatever, once a week meetings, once every 2 week meetings, until the deliverable is achieved, or until it's decided the deliverable is unachievable. Sometimes you recognize, this problem is too hard to work. We're going to put it on the back burner and proceed with the other problems we were working on. So to kind of begin to wrap up here, what does the media need from you as a consultant? And again, Jim mentioned this up front. The most important thing you bring is objectivity. You are outside of the politics. You may be actually from outside of the market that they work in. And you apply that objectivity on people. You apply it to problems. You apply it to assumptions. So that's first and foremost. The second thing, especially when you've been in the business as long as I have been, as long as Jim has been, you develop a certain Rolodex, a certain set of contacts. I have certain things I know a lot about, and there are certain things I know that's an important problem, and there are experts who can solve that for you. It's not me. And then if the client asks, you make an introduction. Or you say, this is what you're looking for. Here are the requirements of the expert you're looking for this. And here's where I would go look for them. The last thing is, you are kind of, and this goes back to the coaching piece of all consulting, is you're a bit of a sounding board. Listen, if it's personal, you keep it personal, but a lot of your work, especially with executives, is going to be quiet listening to what's happening, how they talk about things. This is the hardest thing about virtual consulting, and again, Jen mentioned this up front, is a lot of listening is not actually language, it's body language. How a person sits in a room, how they hold their arms when somebody else is talking, how they conduct a meeting. That all tells you something is right in the world or something is wrong in the world. And so being able to as the outsider, to kind of interject and find out, okay, what's going on here. And that's part of getting things done. So the last couple of things are much more specific. So do they need work product from you? Do they need you to write something? Do they need you to write a report? Do they need you to write a job description? Do they want you to build the organization chart? That depends. Some of it depends on the consultancy agreement. Did you agree to do that? Some of it depends on the deliverable itself. Sometimes there are little things that nobody sees. This is a little bit, I think, the question about what if somebody doesn't do what they need to do to get to the outcome. Sometimes, and this is just, sometimes it's easy just to sit down and it's like, here's a sample job description for what we're looking for. Let me give it to you. You edit over it, but let me just give it to you. I have an example because it moves the process. Because what will happen is it's a small item that sits on top of a large to-do list, and it may not move. So if you want to keep this recruiting process moving, you give a template for that particular job description. Employee evaluations, again, I think are like work product. It depends. Is it part of the agreement? The other thing is, I personally don't do this unless it's transparent to everybody on the team that they're being evaluated. So I don't do secret evaluations. I don't believe it is a good way of managing a company. But some consultants do. It's part of they're evaluating how well you perform in your job in order to determine whether, especially in organizational work, I don't do it unless it's transparent to everybody. That part of this is understanding where the team has skills gaps, where they need training, where there's process improvement, or where there are personnel improvements. Ideas. They definitely want ideas from you. And they want to hear how, I find this especially true outside of Europe and North America. People want to know what works, how it works, what works where. I also am always very careful about European and American examples because they're two very, very unique environments. So just because it works in Cincinnati doesn't mean it's going to work in Yangon. It's almost guaranteed not to work in Yangon. So I would say making sure that when you do give ideas, when you give examples from other places or make sure that the context of that place is also presented. So, because it's easy to forget, oh, well, the New York Times has subscription, we'll have subscription too. Not necessarily going to work. And then just a couple of caveats to round out, and then I'll be quiet for a while. Local politics. So again, I come at this as a business consultant. So if local politics is an important aspect of the business, unless you're an expert in that particular market, that particular politics, be very careful of it. Be very mindful of because you can easily get people following advice that may end up working to the detriment of the institution itself. Employee performance, focus on the review process. Focus, if they don't have a review process, kind of present employee performance as part of a process, as opposed to he doesn't know what he's doing or she doesn't know what she's doing and needs to leave. Try to stay out of personality conflicts. It's very easy in small organizations for personality conflicts to become almost like family arguments. The last thing on caveats is revenue and operations. Every market and region is different. We can say, oh, everybody has advertising, but I can tell you advertising in some markets works in one way and advertising in other markets works in another way. They are only united by what they're called. The tricks on the margin, so how does somebody make more money from YouTube in X market versus in Y market? Those tricks can make all of the difference to the success or failure of a media institution. And because of that, I am very respectful of local tricksters, people who know how to work the system in a market. Because being able to work the system is not something that I will know. Or if I know it, it's the exception to the rule. And a lot of times those tricks are a constantly evolving dialogue among people in the market. So listening carefully to make sure the tricks are legal, making sure that they are productive. But those tricks can often make a lot of difference. And so I try to give a lot of time and respect to that. And with that, I'm going to be quiet and turn the floor back to Pauline.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ross. There is no other questions so far, but I'm sure that they will come up in the next few minutes.
There's one for Ross.
There's one to Ross from Enrique. Yeah.
Yeah.
You
want me to read it out?
Yeah.
So
because on the recorded session, there will be no chat box.
So I'll read it out loud. Yeah.
Okay,
so
good.
How do cultural differences factor into virtual consultancy? Dating phase is very important in Asian cultures, so it can be difficult to find out exactly what the problem is. For example, especially without face-to-face meetings. I can't agree more. This is why data for me is often very important. Data removes, in my experience, and I'm with Enrique. I work mostly in Southeast Asia and East Asia, where and it's kind of as Jim was saying, the work product, if it's your work product, it is likely to create embarrassment. If you remove the who and you just distill it to the numbers, if possible, it allows you to ask questions about what's happening that hopefully will remove some of the face, some of the potential for embarrassment or the potential for exposure. The other thing I would say is sometimes you have to work longer. I find engagements in Asia do take longer because that first meeting or two can turn into 5 meetings. It's not uniform, but I do find, so the setup meeting in Japan can easily last 4 hours, just because of the way communications happens, the detail with which everything has to be decided. Oftentimes you'll have to take a break so conversations can happen on the side. So I would give yourself some time to build credibility and the personal relationship that allows you to talk about things personally. The other thing to Enrique's question is, I'm not sure, I'm guessing from the name Enrique is a woman.
Yeah, I think so.
Women have a particularly difficult time doing virtual consultancies in parts of Asia, for this very reason, because in addition to face, you have male-female dynamics. And that adds a whole nother level of politeness and distance. And so and the only good answer I have for this is try to remove it from personality and it will take longer.
Okay. There's a question by Gilberto from Brazil. How to deal with possible customers in very polarized environment where your company is seen as tool of communist or the enemy, or at least it's a target of misinformation on a daily basis because it bothers federal government for doing journalism. Okay, this is like question right now concerning especially probably fake news in Brazil. Mm-hmm. And also the recent president who is attacking the media outlets on a regular basis. I'm not sure, James, if you can answer the question.
Well, this is very interesting. As it so happens that I happen to be very intimately involved with this question.
Oh yeah, okay.
I'm not sure that in a polarized environment, and I think that we have something very similar in the United States, where there are media organizations that are becoming identified either rightly or wrongly with one side or the other. And the politicians are attempting to control the narrative about which media organizations should be trusted and followed and which media organizations should not. I'm not sure I have a solution to that. Frankly, I'm looking for a solution. The only thing I think that you can do is, as much as possible, find trusted sources that are not identified with either of the polarized parties, but even trusted scientists and physicians in the U.S. market, for example. This is also happening in Europe. The politicians will want to put that particular scientist or physician in a particular political camp, whether they belong to that camp or not. So I'm not sure I have a solution except to try to find those moderating, scientific, expert parties who are using data. Again, this would be Ross's advice: stick with the data and avoid the personalities. But in this kind of polarized environment, it's difficult. Ross, do you have any further observations on that?
You know, I on the news side, again, I'm a business guy. On the news side, I can't. You just have to keep at it. I actually understood. So if it's a question about advertisers, then there are lots of tricks to get around the system. So if you're in a market where government advertising accounts for a lot of advertising and you've been banned, it happens a lot. It certainly happens a lot out here. One of the easy things to do is to move to, it will reduce your revenue some, but it'll still give you access to advertising. Move to blind ad networks like Google AdSense and Tribal Fusion, where advertisers choose the audience, they don't choose the media. And so you'll still get ads from government. They just won't know they're on your site. But if that was the question, it's a trick. It's an old Malaysia Kini trick, actually. But on the news side, no, I don't have. It's kind of why you're in the business, you know.
Maybe one of the listeners has some advice for Gilbert. Maybe you have some experience. Somebody in the audience has some experience.
Yeah, you can share it in the chat box if you want, or also raise your hand and say it loud if you want. But what would be also interesting for me, basically, would be, for example, is there a difference according to your point of view when we are talking about a consultant or a coach or a mentor, or is everything the same according to you? What do you think?
I think Ross really demonstrated the difference between a consultant and a mentor, or a consultant and a coach. I think he has presented that very clearly, that the main difference is you're coaching the institution and the institution's results, whereas as a coach, you're working with a person, maybe a team, and it's smaller scale usually, and very often I'm working with very small groups, very small newsrooms, and that kind of dynamic works better. But when you're working with, as Ross does, as a consultant, particularly with larger institutions, you are focused on the results of that institution. That would be the big difference.
Yeah, I would agree with James. Coaching is a very personal thing, and sometimes it is part of an institutional plan, the coaching, but consulting is really, there are problems, and sometimes there is some coaching you have to do within a consultancy to get things moving. But consultancy is really more, what are we trying to achieve here? We're trying to achieve greater organizational effectiveness. All right, let's talk about the problem. That's something an individual won't be able to solve those problems. That's an organizational approach. The organization will have to solve the problem. So dealing with it as an organization. But that's really the difference. I mean, honestly, consultancy for me is easier because it's very formulaic. You set out how it's going, what are the problems, what are the deliverables, what's the timeline, who's working on it, and then you just work the problem. Coaching is a very fluid, coaching is a bit like teaching. You're individually working with a person on how they speak, how they work with people, their own self-confidence. I find that incredibly hard. I'm not as good as Jim is at it. So I tend to pull myself back into the numbers, which is kind of another big difference between, you may never look at an income statement when you're a coach. It's one of the only things I almost always like to look at is, all right, so give me some sense of how the organization's doing. Yeah, what's it costing every month to run it? But they are very different things. One can include the other. Consultancy can include, I've actually worked on big projects where we've had coaches as part of the consulting project. And I actually Jim might find a mentoring engagement where you need to get a consultant to fix this financial management issue. So they can include each other, but they come about in different ways.
So we have another 25 minutes for questions if you do have some. If you don't, I prepared some questions, so I will ask James and also Ross some questions that might be also interesting for you. As I mentioned, you have a lot of experience in consulting. It's about 15 to 20 years work experience. I don't know if you do count your clients. Do you know how many organizations you consulted in the past 15, 20 years? Or you don't count them?
In the last 15, so in my consulting career, 100, 150 maybe?
People who I've coached, I'd say it's something like 30 maybe, or 40, something like that.
Okay. And what are the key learnings of virtual consultancy? If you gained some like 1, 2, 3 points that are like your key learnings, perhaps you also mentioned them, but perhaps you can wrap them up again for getting a glimpse into your rich experience.
Well,
Jim, I'll let you take that one.
Well, one of the things that with dealing with, I'll give an example. I worked with 10 media organizations from Latin America over a period of 6 months. I helped select them, and then I worked with them in a series of webinars, a webinar every 2 weeks or something. No, a webinar every month for 6 months. And then I was sharing materials for them to use, examples, case studies, and things like that. So after a year, okay, so then we wrapped up the consultancy, and then, we did some metrics on, what happened to their revenue, was there revenue increase, audience increase, and that sort of thing. And the numbers were all good. Everybody had revenue increases and everybody had audience increases. What did that have to do with me? I have no idea. All I know is that those people, to a greater or lesser degree, were committed to change. Okay, so then I was curious, and maybe 2 years later, I just went back and I looked at what are those 10 organizations doing now? And if you think about the failure rate of startups, which is generally, people say the failure rate of startups is like 80% after 2 years or something like that, whatever that number is. Well, of those 10, 2 had just completely abandoned entrepreneurship. 3 had gone in, had made like significant changes, but they were still doing media, but in a very different way, different topic or something like that. And 5 were still doing pretty well. They had significant revenues. Well, first of all, they had survived. So what did they learn from me? I asked them. And the answers were pretty vague. To some degree, here's, I think, one of the main things that people get out of coaching is that, or what I try to give them is, you don't need permission from anybody to be an entrepreneur. You don't have to ask permission. You don't have to ask my permission, and you don't have to do it the way I would do it. You can do it however you want. So whatever may be holding you back could be you. You may be your own biggest obstacle. I guess that's one of the things that I've learned, is that often the person I'm mentoring, the biggest obstacle is their sense that they need somebody's permission, or that they can't do it. And what I tell them is, or I try to help them get to the point where, if you want to do this, you can do it, and I'll help you. And so why not try it? Okay, so maybe they have it. Mr. Breiner, I have an idea for something such and such. Okay, well, what would it take to get it started? Okay, well, let's do that. Let's try it. And if it works, great. If it doesn't work, then go on to something else. So it's the process of, I guess what I want them to learn is the process of the lean startup: build, measure, learn. So try something, measure the results, learn from it, and try again. Build something, try it, learn, try again. It would be that would be like the one main thing I'm teaching. And I'm glad you asked that question, because I hadn't really thought about what I teach, but that's one of the main things. That's it.
Ross?
So let me make sure I understand the question correctly. things that I have learned from that I would say these are these are the things I've learned from the virtual consultancy process. This is
now key learnings like that you can share with other consultants within the consultancy process.
Okay, so there are some process things, especially if you're doing this virtually. The mechanics of the meeting, the pre-work, the agenda, the follow-up, and that everybody is there on time, prepared to discuss, willing to discuss. Those mechanics, because we assume them when we're working together in a conference room. Just making sure that that roadmap, because so many people have moved to virtual communications, it has made all of the difference in the work that I do in the last 6 months, because I've had to learn it, and oftentimes I've learned it from the clients. In terms of my approach, I completely agree with Jim. If you're working with an entrepreneur, you know, what is it you want to try? Try it, measure it, learn from it, and then do things that work, keep doing things that don't work, stop doing. The other thing that I would say, and maybe it's because I work in a lot of very different markets that it's easy to say, oh, all Asia is the same, which we know is patently not true, is that's why the pre-work on any client for me is incredibly important. What does the market look like? What do you know about the market? What are the requirements of just making sure that you have a handle on that you are as fluid and conversant in how the market works from a media standpoint as the client is. I'll give you an example. I was working on a team with another consultancy organization, and it's a very large commercial consultancy who usually charges quite a bit of money, and they sent in some very young consultants to a very seasoned old media house in a market in Southeast Asia. And they basically took a report from another market, changed the language, changed the names, and reissued it. And in the meeting, I had to point out to them that they have made a lot of important points about how Google can be an important revenue stream, except Google AdSense is not available in this market. It is legally not available, and they just assume. So don't get caught making assumptions. Go in with as much time and as much detail as possible, especially if you're working with an entrepreneur or you're working with a small media organization, because they're going to make room for themselves by forcing themselves into a crack between two things. So it means you need to be as conversant with those little fissures in the media market as they are. So do your homework is the only other thing I would add to the lean startup process.
There occurred some questions in the chat box. Thank you for them. And sorry for the noise. I don't know if you hear that. In front of my apartment, there's a huge construction site, and it's getting louder and louder. And I mute myself so often as I can. But sometimes I would like to ask you also the questions. There were questions by Julia and also by Gilberto and Enrique. And Julia, for example, is asking, how do you handle a situation where an organization hasn't chosen to have a consultant, but been asked to have one? Can you answer to that?
I've done that. So let me ask, the question for Julia is, on what basis? Who's asked them and why do they deserve the right to ask them that? Are they an equity owner? Do they own a portion of the company? But what gives them the right to their funder? So I'd have to ask usually you have to be prepared. So I've done this twice in my life. They're incredibly painful engagements. Both times the CEO was terminated, and I had to do interim CEO work for about a year. So I would say if there is really strong pushback to the consultant, you should be prepared as a fund. You have a bigger organizational problem than whatever you were asking the consultant to do. You have a leadership problem, and if you have legal rights to fix it, then I would say fix it first. If you don't have legal rights to fix it, I'm not really sure how you manage it. Funders are, funders are hard because you have all of the not ownership in the sense of equity, but all of the ownership in the sense of joint purpose as the media, but you have none of the legal rights. It's one of the reasons I find funders, you get a lot of respect from me because you work in such a gray zone. Equity, if I'm an equity owner, I have some very specific rights and I can address them in the board. Funders, very seldom do you get a board seat. Is
there anything that you would like to add, James?
No, I think that says it very well.
Good.
Thanks, Ross.
Gilberto asks, do you have a list of foundations that are funding startups to share with us? Oh, a secret list of foundations. So that like, perhaps, like there are probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 international foundations that are eager to support and to finance startups, but you don't have a list like that, right?
Well, there actually is a database of foundations that fund media, and I can never remember the name of it, but I can look it up. I've shared it with some other people. If I'm going to go look for it, and before this meeting is over, I'll have it for you. I'm going to go look for it right now.
Good. And there's a question by Enrique. Do you see the current crisis as an accelerator to moving the focus online for media organizations?
Yeah, that's yeah, absolutely. Absolutely moving online. The question is online how? You're seeing a lot of people innovating storytelling, especially in Asia. Enrique, you're probably seeing some of this in Myanmar right now, where people are telling stories in short video, they're telling stories in audio. But yeah, the combination of moving to online, in fact, that in a lot of places in Asia, bandwidth is increasing pretty dramatically. East Asia, most markets are moving to 5G. Like I just got 5G signal in my office today. So bandwidth will change what's online, and the people that haven't been online will be forced. They've been forced almost by the virus situation.
Sorry for interrupting you. Yeah. Enrique specified her question, online publishing and using social media to connect with audiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the answer is absolutely.
Okay. There are no other questions so far by the audience. I have 2 or 3 others. Perhaps you can tell us what is the biggest advantage when we are talking about virtual consultancy in comparison to face-to-face consultancy. The biggest advantage and the biggest disadvantage would be fine.
The biggest advantage is speed. You actually get to do things faster. You can set up a meeting. It's almost as if you're on site. So your meetings can be scheduled and set up very quickly. Communications, especially if you include some sort of chat tool in your communications, whether it's a WhatsApp group or. So I currently have a couple of consulting projects going on, and we have either created Slack channel, or we have a WhatsApp group, or in one case there's a secret, everybody mails to the same Proton Mail account. It's actually a security is an issue in this client. And so everybody has access to the Proton Mail account, and when you have something to say, you mail to the Proton Mail account. The disadvantage is what Jim was talking about. A lot of this is about communications, and I'd say 60-70% of communications isn't verbal, right? It's not something you can hear, it's something you have to see.
Yeah, one of the big advantages of being physically present, if you walk into somebody's office, you can see drama all around you. And sometimes, you'll be in a meeting with somebody, and just the people who are sticking their heads into the meeting, or people who have to get up and leave the meeting. I mean, all of this drama is information that helps you understand what's going on, who's responding to who's important enough to leave the meeting, who can't leave them, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you get a sense of the dynamics of an organization.